I think it's appalling that people are killed because they're lonely. I mean, that's not a civilized country at all.
Hello, I'm Glenn from Speak Life. We try to see all things through the lens of Jesus. Today we have a real treat. This is my conversation with Lord McColl. Ian McColl has had a distinguished career as a medic and as a parliamentarian. He was Professor of Surgery at Guy's Hospital for decades, and then he was the Parliamentary Private Secretary to John Major. He then became the Shadow Minister for Health between the years of 1997 and 2000, and he is currently a Lord. And he joins me from the House of Lords, where he is a peer. We speak together about matters of life and of death, of what really matters in life and what really matters in death, about the issues of physician-assisted suicide and euthanasia, and the kind of society we want to be. Recently, we released an interview with Professor John Keown about these same matters, but while Professor Keown's expertise is bioethics, Lord McColl speaks from the perspective of a medic and a parliamentarian and a lawmaker. I begin by asking Lord McColl about his Christian faith and where it all began.
Well, I know it began when I was a teenager, and it was meeting people who were Christian and being impressed with the way they lived their lives. They didn't ram their views down my throat, but it's just the way they were, and that's what I wanted to be. I always remember, there were several young men who come back from the war, and they were great examples. There was one called Brance Burbridge, and I found him very impressive. But I had no idea what a distinguished man he was, because he was so modest. He died at the age of 95, I think about 10 years ago. When I read his obituary, I was astonished. He had shot down more German planes at night than anyone else. And as a Christian, he made a point of shooting at the engines, not at the pilots.
Right.
So they had some chance to escape. Then I went to Guy's, and that was a great stimulus to my Christian faith. Not only was I amazed to be asked to conduct ward services, but I conducted 3 with my medical student friends and nurses, 3 services every Sunday in the evening, lasting for 12 minutes each. And it was a wonderful opportunity. And we never had any opposition at all. Amazing. They're very different times.
What do you think your Christian faith has contributed to your view of the medical profession and about life and end-of-life kind of issues?
Well, the example of Jesus, really, the great healer, and how important it is. And to believe that everyone is important. And I learned so much from the people of Bermondsey, who many of them certainly had no university education and so on, but they had wisdom, and that was a very important ingredient.
That will become very relevant as we think about these issues of assisted dying and euthanasia. I guess you had much experience of kind of life or death calls.
Yes.
How did your experience as a professor of surgery kind of start to form your views about the sanctity of life and how you care for people at the end?
Well, I saw my job as alleviating suffering, and so I had no problem with relieving their symptoms. And I had an interesting experience with a patient early on, age 28. She had a cancer of her throat and was dying, and had difficulty in breathing as well. And she was quite distressed, obviously. And I said to her, now I can relieve all your distress and pain with a continuous injection of heroin. And we used to use heroin in those days.
Mm-hmm.
And I slowly gave it and asked her to tell me when the pain had gone. And it turned out to be a huge dose.
Mm.
And not only did it not kill her, it gave her several weeks of pain-free life. Because unrelieved pain is the killer. And as a doctor, it's our job to relieve symptoms, and I had never had any problem doing that. But I was reluctant to give up when there was possibly some hope. For instance, a man came in who ruptured his aortic aneurysm, and he'd ruptured it into his intestines, and that's usually, or was usually in those days, fatal. I operated, and he recovered from the operation and then got every complication in the book and started arresting. And the nurses were very good at resuscitating him. And finally, he said, "I've had enough of this. I want to die." And I said, "Well, you've got a 12-year-old son and your wife has died. Your son needs you. So we'll do our best to keep things going." Well, there was tremendous pressure on me from all round to let him die. And it was really quite a strain, this pressure on me.
Yes.
But I wouldn't give way until a week later. I said, "All right, if he arrests again, we can let him go." And he never arrested again and went back to a fairly normal life.
Wow.
So the cynic is, do not struggle officiously to keep alive. But that was written by a cynical bloke.
Right. Right.
But you have to get it right.
Yes. And there are many different values there that are in tension with one another. I mean, the patient's wishes are one strand.
Yes.
But you are recognizing that people are actually woven together into families and into community.
Yes. Yeah.
And that the community and the family, more particularly, kind of have claims on us, such that at points, even our wishes can be overridden by that greater sense of the fabric of the communities. Is that what's going on there?
I found it important always to sit down and listen to the patient, but also sit down and listen to the relatives.
Right.
Because, they're all one.
That you don't hear that very much these days, do you? I think we live in such an individualistic age. It is about the desires of the individual, and who is anyone else to say differently. But I guess that's quite an atomistic picture of humans. And when you're up close and personal at the end of life, you see very clearly that it is not just one person's tragedy that they're living through. They are woven together in bonds of love and family. Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah.
There was another aspect. I came into conflict with authority quite a lot. And when I was told that I mustn't tell anyone they'd got cancer if they had got cancer, I said, "Well, just a minute. If we've taken off her breast, and I then am told to tell her that it wasn't cancer, the patient knows I'm either incompetent or I'm lying."
Right.
To have taken the breast off when it wasn't cancer is incompetent.
Yes.
And so I'm afraid I couldn't go along with that.
Yes.
And it came to a head when a patient who'd had a mastectomy some years before and had come back in full of secondaries, and she was dying. And I used to go and chat the patients up in the evening, go and sit on their bed and And that's when I found out what was going on. And this lady seized a hold of me and she said, I've been watching you and I think you're a Christian and you won't lie to me. So I said, no, I won't lie to you. She said, I want to know the diagnosis, please. And I said, I won't lie to you, but I just must go and make a telephone call.
Okay.
And I rang up my chief and said, this lady would be much happier knowing what the diagnosis was. And he said, how on earth can they possibly be happier knowing they've got cancer? And then he stopped and said, unless there's some religious reason. I said, there is. Oh, well, then you go and tell her.
Okay.
And I told her, and I then realized that it was quite a strain to do that. And I began to understand why people didn't want to do it.
Yes, yes.
Because then she said to me, will you get a taxi? I need to go home and put my house in order. And I said, certainly not. I've got my father's car here. I'll drive you there. And so I drove her, and they had a dinner party. And I found the whole thing very traumatic, and it made me more sympathetic to people's reluctance to tell all.
Yes.
But I did go telling all.
Yes. What era was this? What year was this?
Oh, this is 1957.
Yes.
58.
And today, where is the medical profession in the UK in terms of letting people know their diagnosis?
Oh, they do, yes.
Yes.
Well, the legal side has come into it too, of course.
Yes, yes. And in some senses, there are all sorts of ways in which we know more than we can possibly handle. In terms of, if someone were to map my genome, they might discover all sorts of, recessive genes, and they might discover all sorts of things that are ticking time bombs. Yes. And you can sort of understand why, too much knowledge can burden a person. But yes. But if you have cancer, it's. I wonder whether so much of that is to do with, well, if you think that death is the end, then that becomes a burden too great to carry. But if you feel that you can die well, then understanding a terminal diagnosis is for the good. Yes. Yeah.
And then I got involved in hospices, quite a few, really. They asked me to be president of the Mildmay Mission Hospital, and it had been closed, being a surplus to requirement. And the lady in charge was Helen Taylor Thompson, wonderful lady, who went to the junior Minister of Health, one Kenneth Clarke, and said, we want our hospital back. And the civil servants had told Kenneth, on no account are you to give them that hospital back. So Kenneth, being Kenneth, said to her, yes, of course you can have the hospital back, but you'll never get any money to run it. And she said, well, we believe in prayer. And he said, well, I wish you all the best. And he used to come to every opening ceremony for years later. A good old chap.
Because you got the money.
So, yeah. And so the government then asked us, would you look after people dying of AIDS, because no one will touch them? And so we said, well, we'd certainly try. And so that's how the hospice opened for people dying of AIDS. And it was interesting how much opposition we got from unusual quarters. It was amazing how many people said, why are you treating these terrible people? I said, well, wait a minute. I may be wrong, but I thought they were people for whom Christ died.
Right.
No?
Right. Yeah.
And then we were looking after so many Ugandan women and children that President Museveni of Uganda came over. And he asked me if I would set up one of these in Uganda. And Linda Chalker, who's the Minister for Overseas Development, gave us the money to do that. And so that was a great step forward.
Yes. And I guess with hospice care, you are very attuned to, there is a sense in which there is a good death. And literally, as a classicist, euthanasia is the Greek for good death. But do you feel like that term has kind of been hijacked as though the only good death is one that happens on your terms?
Yes.
How would you go about describing what a good death looks like?
Well, I think, for one thing, the symptoms must be controlled. And Cicely Saunders was... I succeeded her as president of St. Christopher's, and I knew her very well. In fact, we were medical students together. And she realized that it was no use waiting till they got the pain and symptoms and then giving them medication. What you had to do is to keep them out of it. And you could do that by giving them regular doses, and it would be a lower dose as a result, and so they'd be more wide awake. So that quality is very important. And you recruit people who have expert in picking off particular nerves with an injection of alcohol or something. There are all sorts of ways in which you can help people who are dying. And whatever you do, never say to them, there's nothing more we can do, which is not true.
Right. Because you can alleviate symptoms and you can make them comfortable. Yeah. Yes. What about when you can't? Because I think so much of the sort of pro-euthanasia argument is there is this story of this unconscionable suffering that somebody had to endure, and they just wanted it to be over. I mean, obviously, your heart, our heart, sort of goes out to people in those situations. What do you say when you hear the stories of this palliative care that did not or could not relieve those particular symptoms? How do you respond to that?
Well, the answer is that if you have enough expertise, you can relieve, and you may have to give them doses that really subdue them quite a lot. And if at the end of the day they may not be conscious, but you've got to relieve their symptoms. And the euthanasia lobby say, well, that's cheating. You're just using words. But if you keep your eye on the fact that you must relieve symptoms, that's what a doctor is for.
Right.
But having said that, there are, of course, some cases where, motor neuron disease, very distressful, can be a very distressful end. But I think there's a lot to be said for moving them into a hospice, because they would be able to have constant vigilance to deal with their symptoms.
Yes.
But those cases are difficult.
I guess, especially from your experience as a physician, you have taken oaths to care for people, and the change that it would require to alter the law on that, it would require those whose job had been to preserve life and care to becoming those who would actually kill. What kind of change would that do to the medical profession?
Well, I suspect a lot of doctors would refuse to do it. But who knows what might happen.
Yes. I guess one way of finding out is going to the experience of other countries, and so countries like Switzerland or the Netherlands or Belgium or in the States, I guess Washington State, Oregon. have euthanasia. Canada as well, it has been in the news quite a lot.
Yes.
What do we learn from those overseas experiences?
Well, what I've learned is, and are horrified when I learned, how many of them are given euthanasia because they're lonely.
Right.
And that figure is increasing. It was, I think, 14% in Canada in 2014, and it rose to 1 in 5 in 2021.
Goodness.
So it's, I think it's appalling that people are killed because they're lonely.
Right.
I mean, that's not a civilized country at all.
No.
And so I'm not at all. I'm very upset about that.
Yes. I think 30,000 have died through the MAID program in Canada, and 10,000 of those were just in the last year. So it's I think it came in 2016. So it's definitely accelerating in Canada, and it's now becoming one of the chief causes of death. I think something like 3.3% of Canadians died.
Yes.
Through MAID.
And of course, one of the things that all my professional life I've been very keen on is dealing with abuse.
Right.
And the amount of abuse that goes on is very worrying. I mean, I can remember one family saying to the older members of the family, it's about time you went because we need our inheritance.
Mm.
That's a terrible thing to say.
Right.
And of course, the pressure on people, I think one figure was 34% had euthanasia because they felt they were a burden on their family. Well, that's not a civilized practice at all.
Yes. And it's a very different conception of humanity, as though we were not meant to be burdens, as though we were not meant to be dependent or to rely on one another, because we've got this myth of the atomized individual who can strongly march through life, and when I have decided my time is up, I make the decision and all falls to me.
Yeah.
And you sort of lay that against just the reality of our humanity, where we're embedded in families, we're embedded in a wider culture, where we rely on people in the beginning of life, we rely on people at the end of life, and that's no bad thing. It's a very human thing, and it feels to me like euthanasia is actually a very inhuman conception of the human person, as though we are atomistic individuals and our choice is everything.
But so many arguments put forward are nonsense. I remember one distinguished lord who got up in a debate on euthanasia and told the story of a driver of a petrol tanker which crashed, and he was trapped in his seat, and he asked a passing policeman to shoot him dead so he wouldn't be burnt alive. And this noble lord said, and the policeman, quite rightly, shot him dead. And I couldn't resist getting up and saying, well, I've heard that story before. It's not true, and it never will be true, because no policeman would be daft enough to fire a gun at the sight of a crashed petrol tanker.
Right. Right. Yeah.
But I think the law as it stands is like a great dam holding back the enthusiasms and wildest excesses of the wild men. And so long as it's there, that's great. But the moment you get a crack in the dam, as you might with assisted suicide, the whole thing can give way. That's the problem.
Yes. And do you foresee that in the UK experience?
Well, I think it's possible. That's why we must fight it tooth and nail.
To what degree do you think the arguments against euthanasia are Christian at a sort of an explicit level? And to what degree do you think you can argue from a sort of wider natural law perspective?
Well, I know quite a few people who are not Christian, who are atheists, who are opposed to euthanasia on the basis that it's unjust and open to abuse.
Mm.
I mean, I don't think we can force our Christian values on other people, but I think we can support the law and keep the law as it is for other reasons, like stopping abuse and bullying that can so easily occur.
Yes, absolutely. People are in a very vulnerable state at the end of life, and the possibility for bullying is right there. Yeah. So if people were wanting to find out more about this particular subject or more about some of the work that you do, where should they go?
The real answer to the euthanasia is to have a much more extensive hospice system throughout the country.
Right.
And we need to put more money into it. A lot of it is funded privately by donations. And in particular, children's hospitals. Hospices need a lot of support.
That's a very proactive thing that people can do.
Yes.
Absolutely. Yes, that's a great place for you to point people towards. Well, Lord McColl, thank you so much for sparing time for us. And I think you've got my grey matter worrying on all these sorts of issues. And I think what we've discussed has all sorts of implications, not just for the end of life, but for what we think is a good life and what we think humans are and what our society should be. So you've helped us think through some of the deep stuff in life. Thank you so much.